Before introducing our speaker, I would like to first introduce myself, Joshua Landis. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And I would like to thank Marjan Sarafipour, who has organized this entire event with the help of some strapping graduate students and undergraduate students. Kevin Pope, Harris Nadim, Ilana Slater have fixed this place up, got the chairs, done all the little stuff, and we're going to have a beautiful reception afterwards. So once we're finished, around an hour and 20 minutes from now, we will go out and have a reception, and it's catered by La Baguette, I believe. So we're going to have a little taste of the Middle East, even if it's not Yemen. And now let me introduce our real guest today, and this is his debutante ball. This is the coming out of Waleed Mahdi, who is a new professor here this year. It's his first year, and he is from Yemen. So we thought we would kidnap him and get him to explain Yemen for us. He is a new assistant professor of Arabic language and culture in both the departments of International and Arab Studies and Language and Literature and Linguistics. His current book project is called Spectacles of Otherness, Articulations of Arab-American Difference in U.S. and Arab Cinema. He is also engaged with scholars from Columbia University and the University of Jordan and Doha Institution with a big grant of almost about $500,000, I believe it is, to work on a project that's funded by Qatar on transcultural identities and contemporary Arab social movements. He is also conducting research about Yemen for his second book project about the turmoil in Yemen since 9/11 and the Arab Spring. He teaches courses on U.S.-Arab cultural encounters, America through Arab eyes, the cultural politics of contemporary Islam, Arabic literature and culture, and the United States since 1911. So he really does both sides of the Middle East and America. He got his BA in English Language and Literature from the Department of English at the College of Arts and Taiz University, Yemen, in 2003.
Somewhere around there. So.
He was a Fulbright scholar and came to the United States in 2007. He studied and got his master's degree in cultural studies and comparative literature at the University of New Mexico, and then a PhD in American studies and U.S. Middle East cultural history at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities in 2015. So, and he is also married to Basma Mahdi. Is Basma here? Basma, will you stand up and just say hello to everybody? Basma is about to have their first child coming soon. And so it's very nice to have both of you in our community and to have you here to talk to us about Yemen today. So on that note, let us welcome Waleed Mahdi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. And I want to jump right in,
All right.
Professor Mahdi, and ask you, the first question is really, how did the civil war in Yemen start? What has led us to this major conflagration? I'm going to ask you about Saudi Arabia, Iran later, but domestically, what happened inside Yemen?
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of, development going on in the past 20 years in Yemen. So it didn't all start since 2011, as some in the media would like to propose. Let me quickly start by maybe introduce the map and quite introduce our audience to Yemen, for those of you who might not know much about the country. But before that, I would love to quickly highlight the humanitarian crisis that's going on there. It's the country overall size is less than 40,000 square miles, smaller than Texas. It has a population of around 25 million people. 80% of that has been declared to have suffered or to be suffering from some form of humanitarian need currently. 14 million people alone, I mean, have been estimated by the United Nations to be in dire need of food. They're experiencing food insecurity. 3 million alone of them also, mothers and children are suffering from malnutrition. 1 million suffers from acute malnutrition. So when we're talking about this situation in this country, it's real. People are suffering. I mean, I'm experiencing that at the very personal level. I have a lot of family and friends across Yemen. But let me quickly introduce introduce you all to this quick map here. So, of course, this map is allocated in terms of what's going on, who is in control of what. But overall, Yemen's history is divided between the north and the south, for the most part, really. And it wasn't until 1990 that the country got united. Before that, before the 60s, actually, the most part of the south was controlled by the British. The most part of the north was controlled by kings. But 60s onward, there were revolutions taking place across the country. And there were interesting geopolitical developments ever since. 90s, I mean, if we were to talk about the civil war that's happening these days in Yemen, we can't be wrong by going all the way back to the 90s, because it all started from there in a sense. The Socialist Party that was controlled most of the South got united with the ruling party there, GPC, we call it, the General People Congress Party, that has already in alliances with the Islamist party, Islah, called as well. So there was a unity of some sort in 1990, but that unity 40 years later broke off. And it broke off in a way, and the whole country experienced a civil war. And the way the war was conducted, and the way the Southerners were treated in the aftermath of the war, created so many grievances that reverberated until now. So what happened is that since 1994, there have been grievances developing from the socialists, from the Islamists, from even the GPC folks. But these grievances were developing along lines of sectarian, tribal, and regional anxieties for the most part, really. Fast forward 2011, the ruling party collapsed in the aftermath of the wave that crossed the Arab world, the Arab Spring. In Yemen, it took place. The revolutions. Revolutions started technically from February 2011, but it wasn't until February 2012 that there was a serious change in the head of the government, and the president had to step down because of the pressure. But the way he stepped down created conditions for the civil anxieties that we would experience today. He stepped down with an agreement, an initiative blessed by the Gulf countries, oil-rich countries for the most part, and the United Nations, Russia, United States, and that guarantee offered him immunity and allowed him to stay in power and rule for the most part his own party, which is, according to the agreement, had to split governance with the Islamists 50-50. So technically, they stayed in power, and that, in a way, created momentum for counter-revolutionary forces to start to coalesce and organize and take shape. But in the meantime, we have the Houthis emerging from the north, the top of the north, Saada there. That's their stronghold, north of the north. It's this a place called Saada. They started organizing, and they've been organizing for some time, and it all again goes back to the 90s. And most of their rhetoric is organized around social calls for social inclusion, social justice, but they use a lot of religious rhetoric along the way, and some anti-American agenda. You got the magic formula, really, to rally some people around you. So they started moving towards the capital, and the capital. So we have Saada, we have Hajjah. Hajjah has access to the Red Sea, and you have Sana'a. That's the capital of the Yemeni government. They eventually took control of Sana'a back in September 2014. 6 months later, Saudis intervened, and we got into a mess. And now the country is going through a war within a war at the civil level between the Houthis and the ex-government, the ex-leader president, who his name is Ali Abdullah Saleh. They formed a coalition, and they are fighting on the one side, and you have the whole other side, which is a socialist party, Islamist party, the rest of politically disenfranchised groups in the country, of course covered by Saudi support. And Saudi support is somehow part of a coalition. They managed to compose that coalition consisted of a number of Arab countries and Muslim countries. And of course, the United States has provided some logistical support along the way. So we are, here we go. I mean, fast forward,
So tell us,
October
what
2011.
is, we've had the what is Aleppo question.
Yeah.
What is a Houthi?
Yeah.
What is a Houthi? To what extent is this a war about religion? And to what extent is that just, how does religion play into this?
Yeah.
What is a Houthi and how are they different from a Sunni? And to what extent is this about religion and sectarianism?
So if we look at the north of the country, I mean, that part of the Saada, Hajjah, Sana'a, Damar, this part of the country is mostly controlled by what we call in Yemen Zaydis. And Zaydis are a part of Shia, but they are the closest to the Sunni in terms of religious rhetoric and how they question their identity. They've been called and labeled throughout history, and they ruled Yemen for 1,000 years. They've been called the Shia of the Sunnis, and some call them the Sunnis of the Shia. So they are really, really close in terms of affiliation, thinking, to most part of the Sunni. But for the most part of the past 30 years, what has happened is that there has been a Saudi wave of influence that created space for Sunnification, we call it, of some of these Zaydi communities, to the extent that 30 years later, 2011, 2012, you see a very interesting mix. You see the head of the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood Sunni party is a Zaydi, but a Zaydi who doesn't claim his Zaydi identity in terms of on religious grounds, but he claims it on tribal grounds. So Zaydism at some point morphed into an identity that for some meant religion, for others meant tribe, and for others, the ex-president Ali Abdullah Saleh, who is back to power now, is Zaydi as well. For people like him, it meant political advantages. So, I mean,
is he Zaydi tribally or is he Zaydi religiously?
He is tribally, of course. So all of a sudden, you'll see since the 90s, many Zaydis, at least those who got control of the power, they managed to be part of the mainstream, because the mainstream is Sunni. Zaydis constitute only 35% of the population. So they became part of the mainstream Sunnis. At the same time, what has happened is that, and some call the rise of the Houthis as a move or a wave for Zaydi revivalism. So they wanted to revive Zaydi traditions, religious traditions, and those traditions that entitle them to control, because there is a link at some point in religious thinking that qualifies who gets to rule whom, and that is, for the most part, defined by your own ancestry. So the closest you are to the Prophet's household, Prophet Muhammad's household, then the more legitimate your claim to throne becomes. So their push for that sort of rhetoric created an anxiety that was met aggressively by Al-Qaeda folks, the extremists of the Salafis, and at the same time, the mainstream Muslim Brotherhood didn't welcome that as well. But for the most part, not on religious grounds, but for political reasons. And what happened eventually is that the intervention of the Saudi government made it all seem that what's happening in the country is strictly sectarian, and that is what Yemenis are going through. They're going through a proxy war that is basically between Iran and the Saudis. Well, in fact, when you think or when you look at the complexity of the situation, you realize that it's not about religion, it's not about tribalism, it's not about sectarianism. It's about them all. But for definitely the foreign and the regional interventions exacerbated the situation and made it seem to look like one way. And the media didn't help either, especially in the West, where there's a tendency to view the Middle East in general in terms of these are people who've been fighting all over their life for thousands of years. So that's how it is, while in fact that there are so many geopolitical factors that really contributed to the demise and created conditions for anxieties that until now we are paying the price for. So when it comes to, Shia, Sunni, there are so many Yemenis who are sushis, we call them. Sushis, you're a Sunni Shia in a way. So sectarianism was never a major issue to many Yemenis until recently, of course.
So the Saudis, 2015, March 2015, the Saudis built this coalition that's now entered into the war. What is Saudi Arabia trying to achieve? And what does it hope to achieve in this war?
Yeah. What they are saying now is that they are promoting democracy in the country. Very interesting, right? Very interesting. Well, it's not about democracy, of course. The rhetoric or the legitimacy they're driving behind is that we have an exiled government living now in Saudi Arabia, represented by the President Hadi, who was the legitimate leader of the country prior to the Houthis' invasion of the capital. So they want to restore that legitimacy to power. And he is legitimized by the international community. Everybody seems to recognize his presence, except the Houthis and their allies, in a way, in the country. So their primary interest is to...
Were there elections? How was he chosen?
He was elected. The legitimate president, who is now in exile, has been elected. Of course, it was a one-man election. It's a mess, trust me. But it was a one-man election. That was part of the initiative led by the Gulf countries again, back to the initiative that I talked about earlier, when they agreed that we'll give immunity to the president to step down, to President Saleh to step down. We will split the governance between these two major parties. And by the way, we're going to do this along the way. We were going to nominate this one man as someone who everybody seems to agree on. By the way, he was the vice president of the ex-president, and at some point he decided to deviate away from the rule of the expectations of the ex-president, but that created potential conditions for conflicts. But anyway, so what happened is that Saudis now, they are trying very seriously to push back for this legitimacy to take effect in the country. But not only that, the leaders of the tribal, ex-tribal leaders and military leaders are part of this exiled government. So there is an interest in pushing everybody back to the country. And of course, these are the forces that represent Saudi's interest in the country. Without them, it seems that at least the decision maker in Saudi Arabia has concluded rather hazardly and rushed to conclude that we won't be able to deal with these other new forces. These new forces are only more troubles. They are Iranian proxies. We won't be able to handle them. So the only way out is to basically enforce the return of our own folks, basically, in the country. But these, again, they have legitimacy, international legitimacy. They have been the president has been voted into office. Of course, there was some interesting conflicts around the way he ended up running the show after the Houthis invaded Sana'a. He was put in house arrest. He had to flee to the south, to Aden there, by the Gulf of Aden. So he had to flee Aden. Houthis followed him and started attacking him. So he had to flee and then to Saudi Arabia. So he didn't have any proper ground to rule, technically, really, the country. There was, during his rule, there was an interesting constitution drafted, and that constitution would have really offered Yemenis I mean, the sinking boat. I mean, we're all in sinking boat in a way in Yemen. So that would have offered them really hope to kind of transition really into what they've been talking about that time as a new Yemen, a Yemen that is decentralized, ruling is decentralized. They divided in that constitution the country into 6 regions because that at least is the number of regions that you can think of when you think of Yemen and local governance. You need to divide them at least into 6 regions that allow for local governance in a way. And that was the best way out, really. But again, the Houthis invasion, the exiled government rally around the Saudis' invasion, war, exacerbated the whole situation. So, but I mean, my point is, personally, I think we were in Yemen. I mean, this is also, I mean, they were so unfortunate to kind of also, the invasion of Houthis was, it coincided with the death of King Abdullah, who was the ex-king in the country. And who understood the Yemeni situation really well. And I think had he lived to witness and experience what has happened since the Houthis' invasion of the capital, he would have pursued different types of politics. But what we see is, in the aftermath of his death, there is a rise of a new energy around. Of course, the king, Salman, is not doing much. What's being done most of the time is being spearheaded by 2 folks, Mohammed bin Naif, the crown prince, and Mohammed bin Salman, who is the most important, seems to be the most important guy in the country. And he is the deputy crown prince. Of course, there's so much attention given to both of them, just in case, you know, the deputy crown prince may become a king at some point, because he's solidifying his power everywhere. So there is this new energy, new youth, reckless in a way, energy that wanted to test its power. And it seems they had calculations that they may be able to just end it all with a few strikes. And since March 2015 until now, we are still experiencing a siege around the 2 seas of Yemen, the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. And there is a constant aerial bombardments from Saudis and their allies. And they created more conditions for chaos, really.
So pursuing the line of the proxy war, the Saudis have argued that they had to step in because Iran is supporting the Houthis. What is Iran's role here, and greater role in the region, and particularly how does that impact Yemen?
I mean, since the Islamic Revolution in Iran in the end of the 70s, for sure, Iran and the rise of Iran as a regional power has created, along with it, some anxieties, especially in the Arab world. And those, since the Iranian-Iraqi war during the 80s, we witnessed the rise of sectarian-based languages. Of course, for the Iranians, it's an interest in serving minorities for the most part around the Arab world, and majority in the case of Bahrain and Iraq, and to some extent Lebanon as well. So there is an interest, a serious interest from the Iranian part to serve, to cater to the minorities and Shia populations around the Arab world. And their conditions are not really, they are not in the best conditions. I mean, they are going through a lot of pain. But it's not just a Shia problem, you know. It's whoever gets in control, then gets to basically create conditions that favor certain groups along the others. What happened in Iraq, for example, in the aftermath of the US invasion in 2003, is that the grievances shifted from Shia grievances to Sunni grievances. So it's quite complicated, but for sure, Iran, especially with what we've seen, the rise of Shias in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, in a way, there have been some concerns that what we are seeing in Yemen with the rise of Houthis is that Iran is getting somehow the upper hand in dealing with the region, and that has already triggered some grievances among Saudis, especially that Yemen is at the backyard, really, of Saudi Arabia. You know, if you look at the borders, Saudi Arabia is just there, I mean, to the north, and we share with Saudi Arabia the whole a very long border, coastal and desert-wise. So they are seriously concerned that Houthis might be a problem. Houthis decided to do some military tactics along the borders when they started consolidating the power. So they were sending bad signals that freaked out the Saudis in a way. Now, I personally would like to believe that based on what I have discovered so far, and trust me, if you want to do research about Yemen, you have to kind of check at least 5 to 6 resources to make sure that what you're getting is the right piece of information, is an accurate one. It's not blurred by propaganda of any sort, really. So what I realized is that there have been connections, but they were loose connections. They were not as deeply embedded in Yemeni politics as the Saudis or the Gulf or the regional media would like to propose. There was the exiled government claimed to have seized a ship that was sent from Iran that had military weaponry and some experts along with it. And there have been, I mean, immediately after the Houthis got control, they started flights with Iran. And for the first time in Yemen's recent history, that all of a sudden we see direct flights from Sana'a to Tehran. And that was a really interesting development. And these flights would be like 5, the agreement was to establish 5 flights a week between Sana'a and Tehran. And people were saying, what's going on, you know? It's not like there was so active, an active trade of any sort that would give the justification for that action. But that created, speculations that Iranians are involved. And I mean, Iran has never shied away from supporting the Houthis politically in so many ways. And at the same time, there are also, we can trace that some of the Houthi members, at least the elite educated members, have been to Tehran and learned something from them. And some people accusing them not of a Zaydi revivalism, but of an interest in reproducing the Ithna Ashari, the 12er sort of sectarian nature that Iran, that is central in Iran. Personally, I certainly believe that Yemen has never had sovereignty throughout its history. You know, we have been, so many of the regional powers and international powers as well have had a say in how things are run. And the United States has never, pursued a complicated, paradoxical sort of foreign policy towards the country. But this was an interesting development in the sense that to showcase, or at least in the media, propagate that it's Iran, and all of a sudden we started thinking of Houthis not as Yemenis anymore. We don't see them, at least if you keep listening to the media, you can't recognize their Yemeni identity anymore. You know, it's easy. It becomes easy for you to kind of distance them, divorce them from their Yemeni identity, and start seeing them as proxies of Iran or as Majusi, non-believers. Or there are a lot of rhetorics. If you follow this line of logic, then it doesn't lead us anywhere. It only contributes to more justification of what the Saudis have been doing. And I personally said it all the time. If Saudi Arabia has a problem with Iran, stick it to Iran. Why mess with the Yemen? And that's part of the frustration that not only me, a lot of Yemenis are really can't make sense around.
Let me ask one more question before we open it up to the audience. What is America doing in this war? What is America's policy? What are they doing?
Yeah, for the most part, Americans have not really seriously, they've supported the Saudis from the get-go, of course. What happened is that they promised to offer logistical support, mid-air fueling, intelligence information, about where things are and who controls where. But they haven't intervened in a serious way so far. But having said that, only recently, the last couple of weeks, we started hearing that Americans are starting to strike some radar sites in Hodeidah that's supported by the Red Sea. The claim, of course, was, and there was nothing to verify that, but it's an interesting claim that is alarming in so many ways to Yemenis. If America is intervening, that would be crazy. So if that justified for the Americans to strike some sites in Yemen. And there are some discussions, I mean, and some reports or rumors really at this stage that there might be more strikes coming up. But for the most part, the Americans have, in addition to that logistical support, they pursued the drone policy, because Yemen has been subjected to drone strikes since at least the earliest is 2009. And you have Qaeda groups all over the country. And if you look at the map really here, the dark spots here are the spots where you got more Qaeda and extremist groups are in full control. Stripes, of course, they have some control, somehow a loose control, and then in areas like Marib and Taiz where the fight is intense, and to the extent that it has been blurred really to recognize who is fighting for what, we see the rise of extremist Salafis that could potentially signify or announce the rise of more Qaeda groups. So, but before then, anyway, so the Americans have been targeting the country through drone strikes, and that, by the way, has devastated many Yemenis and allowed the Houthis to create their slogan. Their slogan is "Death to America." The very first, it's a four component. There are four components to the slogan, but the first one is "Death to America." Of course, when they were confronted.
What's 2, 3, and 4?
What's that?
What is 2, 3, and 4?
Well, it's "Death to America," "Death to Death to America," "Damn the Jews," "Damn God." I mean, "Victory to Islam," and it's mostly around that. And what happened is basically that it allowed them to rally people around them, because we have witnessed many tragedies across the country, really, where there was at some point a wedding that turned into a funeral because there was a mistake in intelligence, and the Americans had to strike the wrong procession. There was a story in Lahj where it was a disaster. At least 60 people died, and again, wrong intelligence. I mean, when you have, and that's something we can always elaborate later about, the whole logic of drone warfare in a country like Yemen, where intelligence is lacking, precision of information is not there, then there's a lot of anxieties created around that. But yeah, Yemenis have been paying the ultimate price throughout the whole process. We very much hope that the U.S. government won't intervene. So far, they've been trying to cater to the Saudis' decision only because Saudi Arabia is considered an ally, and of course, and the Iranian deal created some more fractures, and there's an interest in not exacerbating the relationship, deteriorating the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia because of the envisioned strategic alliance.
It's about maintaining relationship with Saudi Arabia.
It's all about that. It comes down to that really at this stage.
Okay, well let's open the questions up to the floor. Who is going to? Ilana, are you taking the microphone around? Thank you. Who has a question? Oh, okay, let's have 1 and 2 up there, and we'll go first in the front, and then further back.
So you've already implied your own criticisms of America's drone program in Yemen against al-Qaeda and its tacit support and logistical support for the Saudi coalition. So what would you like to see as either policy reversals or changes to either of those policies on the part of America to ensure that there's actually a lasting peace in Yemen?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, that's the million-dollar question, really, and whether what I want to see is really conceivable in a way, because at the end of the day, it's what ultimately is being decided on the grounds of what works, and for U.S. Foreign policy, at least the temporal stage. There's no like long-term calculations to the damaging effects of that foreign policy in a way. So when it comes to the United States, I mean, one thing I've really wanted to see, I mean, I consider myself a Yemeni American at the end of the day, right? So it's so painful for me to walk through these two spheres where I see the two countries are engaged in or falling victim to a third power like the Saudis, and I won't hesitate to call them for their own crimes in a country like Yemen. So I've always talked about how the United States have been going in the wrong direction when it comes to Yemen, way before the civil war in a way. Because if you take a look at the U.S. embassy in Sana'a and how it would treat Yemenis, you wouldn't conceive the U.S. policy in Yemen as a diplomatic site, but you see it more of a national security sort of center in a way. So from the get-go, the Americans have approached Yemen from a strategic interest, and that strategic interest was mostly defined by kind of anxiety around Al-Qaeda and the rise of extremists. And for the most part, that's what really mattered for the decision maker here in the country. Now, the United States is given a blank check to the Saudis, and that check was signed back in March 2015. I mean, we've heard every now and then some criticism from the White House, but there was no serious consideration, re-evaluations at least, at the minimum expectation. The minimum expectation would be for the U.S. government to re-evaluate the support it's offering to Saudi Arabia, particularly in Yemen. Now, of course, there are strategic interests, there are alliances, there are many calculations. There is so much arms sale going on. There are so many factors to keep in mind. But given the Saudis this ultimate hand in running the scene, running the show, without any sense of contestation, creates more conditions for disasters in a way. Americans are more and more seen as party to the conflict rather than as mediators. John Kerry's missions, at some point, they would have been very effective, but now it becomes, I mean, America is becoming part of the conflict in a very aggressive way. So that's one thing I would love to see. And many Yemenis would if you look at their grievances against America, would love to see a redefinition of how they are dealing with the Middle East in general. But for the most part, when it comes to Yemen, a redefinition for the drone warfare program, a redefinition of their work, of the ultimate support, the utmost support they're offering the Saudis, a redefinition of many things. You know, the problem is the deeper we get into the conflict, the more the war drags on, the harder it becomes really to even envision solutions, other than sometimes in certain scenarios to either completely back off or completely go in, you know. But there are still times, there are still opportunities for the Americans to produce more pressure, at least, on the part of the Saudis because that pressure will materialize in some way in pushing the Saudis to accept certain conditions that are being placed in the table. And of course, if there is a serious pressure, I could see some of that pressure reverberating inside the country. When it comes to the drone warfare, and we'll conclude with this, for example. When it comes to the drone warfare, one of the things we kept saying is that instead of having drone flies and kill people indiscriminately sometimes and bombing inaccurate sites at some others, why can't there be an opportunity for the U.S. government to create a serious coalition in the country? And there were so many tribal forces ready to deal with the issue of terrorism. There were so many tribal leaders who are committed to that. The military at some point were ready to deal with that, but there was no serious coalition built to fight extremism. What happened was basically that the U.S. government relied on the ex-president, who led them to believe that he's fighting the fight, while in fact he's not doing as much. And what he's doing is basically he is eliminating his oppositions. So giving blank checks to certain allies might seem workable for the White House in the short term, but overall, in the long term sort of sense of calculations, it creates potential for disasters. I don't know if I answered your question, but again, it invites more room for discussions, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you.
Where was number 2?
Yep, up there, and then we'll come down to.
All right.
Thank you very much. I have 2 questions for you. The first one, in your opinion, does the U.S. have a role in limiting civilian deaths by Saudi Arabia in Yemen? And what leverage does the U.S. government have over Saudi Arabia to limit civilian deaths from Saudi air-to-ground strikes? And my second question is about the humanitarian situation on the ground in Yemen. How would you characterize the current situation in Yemen in light of the current migrant crisis that we're currently experiencing? How many people are internally displaced, externally displaced? Can you talk about the international response, and what are the most pressing needs on the humanitarian side?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, when I think of civilian casualties, it's painful to remember what happened 2 or 3 weeks ago when Saudi airstrike basically bombed a funeral in the capital in Sana'a, and that resulted in the death of 140 person, of course, people, and the injury of 500 people. Of course, at the end of the day, I mean, I listened today to the foreign minister apologizing for that and saying, "Oh, hey, we're sorry for that. We'll make sure to mend for our mistakes, but at least we're trying to work with it compared to the Russians in Syria and how they are so out of touch with their humanity in a sense." So, I mean, since that particular strike, U.S. government has, for the first time, really. Speaker, White House Speaker, for the first time, and there was at some point also a conversation, an interview with some foreign policy advisors within the State Department that used strong language. You know, there was concern at some point that the United States might be implicated, you know, might be sued. I mean, considered suable for its support, the billions of dollars of worth of arms sale, the logistical support that I talked about earlier, that there is a serious concern to think of when it comes to that. And there was at some point, at least publicly speaking, a statement that circulated that basically said that, I mean, U.S. support won't be without, it's not a blank check. That was what has been stated so far. But we haven't seen really any serious reevaluations of that support. For some time, some congressmen have been pushing for banning arms sale, putting more pressure on the Saudis, but really, there's not much has been done, you know. And that's the unfortunate part and the painful part in a way, that the United States didn't play a more active role in the whole conflict. Again, only because Saudis are already angry about U.S. attitude towards a number of conflicts in the region and countries in the region, and it's really hard to kind of get the Americans to get involved in everything. And I don't know if anybody watched and read the interview that was done with Obama at some point. He sounded really frustrated with the Middle East in a way, and he said Saudi Arabia and Iran has to find a way to live in some way in a cold peace together. So there is a sense of frustration you could sense from the White House. But of course, now new leadership, I can only imagine how things are going with our options, 2 options that we have. But anyways, I think the more critical the response is from the United States, the more serious, I mean, the better the chances for peace to emerge in a way. When it comes to this humanitarian situation, and this is one of the painful, really, things to talk about personally, because, I mean, you have 3.5 million displaced, internally displaced. The refugee crisis, I mean, there's no Syrian-like refugee crisis in the country for 2 reasons. One is that there is a blockade, technically, I mean, a virtual, actual blockade that is surrounding the country. So, and many countries that were initially welcoming Yemen before the crisis, like Egypt, like Jordan, they were welcoming Yemenis without visa. They started all of a sudden creating creating conditions for visa regulations that made it even hard for folks to flee the conflicts. Now we have 3.5 internally displaced. That's a minimum number that has been considered. And my family is one of them in a way. So my house in Taiz city, which is painfully, I mean, this is supposed to be the most educated, the most enlightened city in the country, really, you know. It's somewhere between, geographically it's considered Taiz, it's considered in the south, but politically they are considered part of the north, and we got really caught up in between the two colors, if you like, the mint and the, what's that?
Blood red, I think they call
red,
that.
yeah. Mauve, maybe? I don't know. I mean, and they are, I mean, for cities like Taiz, there is a street fighting happening, you know, and it goes from a neighborhood to the other. People there are paying the ultimate price because they either have forced to flee or experience the indiscriminate firing between the conflicting parties in a way. So there was at some point the United Nations tracked, they've done, they continue to do statistics, of course, and the last one was at least 7,000 dead, and that's just from actual fighting, and we're not talking about those who died because of kids who died because of malnutrition. We're not talking about those who ended up dying because of other related, non-war related issues. And 35,000 injured. That's the most conservative sort of statistics that we had. At some point, the United Nations blamed Saudis for more than half of, maybe 60% of the casualties. That as soon as that report was done, Saudis threatened to start cutting some. I mean, they used the financial card in a way to pressure the Secretary General to back off from that initial assessment and say, okay, we'll do more investigation and see who gets what. But eventually, people are dying. There is a severe need for food, and food is always at the heart of the problem. We're talking about, again, a country that's 80% of its food security is imported. So with this virtual blockade, things are worsening. Now, when it comes to oil and energy, fuel, there is a problem. Even though there is fuel coming to the country, you have those who are technically running the country, the Houthis and their allies, are taking the oil and energy fuels and selling them, either using them in their own markets or selling them in black markets. And whatever aids heading to the country technically evaporates in a way. There are talks, of course, of potential of international organizations, USAID. I mean, there are a number of. I'm in touch with a number of international-oriented groups that are working, and I know some local organizations that are trying their best to cater to the people's needs. You know, but we have problems beyond the food and the energy issues. We have problems with medical needs. There's an issue of power. Power goes. Hospitals are insufficiently. The capacity there is insufficient. You name it, really. It's a crisis that is full-fledged, and there's just a few things that I could think of, and I can only imagine how tough it is to be there. And I am in touch with my family. I'm in touch with my friends, and across the country, really, you know. And it's really hard these days to be. If you are, depends on what color code you are in. If you are in the mint area, then you kind of, at least for some people, they started losing sympathy towards those who are in the mauve area, mauve color area, or the light red area. So, I mean, there's that sense of losing sympathy even among Yemenis that is taking place according to geographical span in the country. And that is seriously problematic. Of course, the crisis won't go away. Now, it has actually, the situation exacerbated now because the exiled government has decided to relocate the central bank from Sana'a, the capital, to Aden, from one color code area to the other. Now, what has happened, and the Houthis decided to hold all the names of government employees. So they didn't want to provide names of government employees to the bank, to the newly established bank. So what you end up having is most of the folks who are employed with the government in the Mint area basically ended up not getting paid, and that created even more tragedy. I can obviously keep speaking of this, but I just love to give space for others to share their thoughts, comments, or
More
ask
questions.
Yeah.
1, 2. Why don't we ask both questions and then we can get them? Yeah.
My answers are long.
Hello. My name's Caroline. I'm a student of both of these professors here. So I would just like to ask, you've briefly touched on the difference, the divide that's traditionally existed in Yemen between North and South. I was wondering if you could explain why we don't see that reflected in the geography of Houthi control here, and maybe how tribal alliances play a part in this whole thing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
Quite a different question, and without taking anything away from the humanitarian crisis, we've seen a lot of history destroyed in
that's
other
on.
conflicts. What I was saying, we've seen a lot of history destroyed in these other conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. What's the historical and cultural kind of cost, and what's at risk in Yemen as this crisis continues?
Yeah, actually, I think they are connected in some way, because it was in 1990 where Yemenis, for the first time in centuries, really, they thought, finally we have a country, a united country called Yemen. So it's no longer the Arabic Republic of Yemen or Yemen Democratic Socialist Party, Republic, which was the name of the southern state. It was all of a sudden Yemen, a Republic of Yemen. And that created a dream for so many people, that finally we get the chance to live, to cross borders, look for opportunities, connect with family members that we will never be able to connect before, get to explore the country in a way. And with strength, there is unity. And with the unity, there is interest in empowerment, in cultural prosperity, in a lot of things. But what happened is in the north, the forces of the north, solid forces of the north, I don't know, just at least in this conflict. In the north, what happened is you have the ex-president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who ruled the country for 33 years. He used a formula, I call it, and not me who call it, a political scientist call it always, politics of risk and opportunity. So the moment you get control of power, you kind of risk it all, and take whatever opportunity you get out of that, And that was disastrous in a way, because what he did was he decided to centralize ruling in Sana'a. So everything was taking place in Sana'a. So if you are from all the way from Mukalla, Hadramaut, you have sometimes, if you have certain paperwork to do, sometimes you'd have to fly to go all the way to Sana'a to get things done. With that centralization, power was concentrated in Sana'a, in the capital. Advantage and favoritism was on the rise to folks who belonged to that to Sana'a, and the culture of Sana'a and Sana'a people got to be at the center of the stage. So you don't get to see the diversity that exists in the country. The country has mountainous people. There are people who live in the coast, and we have a very long coastal line. There are desert people and the plains people, the valleys. In every region you have different dialects, different costumes, different thoughts and concerns and priorities, and politics as well. But when you see that, especially after the Civil War, because what happened was in between the South and the North, and after the Civil War in 1994, the North and people who belonged to the ex-regime got more control. They became more and more powerful across the country. They concentrated the power in their own hands, and by 2011, people were sick of them all. Actually, what happened was, since 2011, the fighting parties, it's all the same people. It's exactly the same people fighting each other for power. So what you see since the 90s, that dream is slowly slipping away from from the hands of the Yemenis. And the idea of being a Yemeni, of a Yemeni culture, of a Yemeni thinking, of a Yemeni way of doing business and way of life is evaporating along the way. And people lose interest in the state. They lose interest in the idea and become more entangled in what makes sense for them. For some, it's the South. Southern have their own grievances because they see the Northerners not being fair in a way. For some, it's religious identity, whether it's a Salafi extremist turned Qaeda, Islamic State sort of person, or it is a Zaydi revivalist, or it is a Twelver, a converted 12er who see that this is the way to go. So, and others rallied around their tribes, because all of a sudden you don't have a support from your state. Your own means of support is around you, is around either your identity in terms of sectarianism, tribalism, regionalism, whatever it is that makes sense to you. And that ultimately created fissures and fractures all along the way. I mean, and what you see since 2011 at least, there have been attempts to give Southerners more rights. The exiled leader is from the South, the one who is now in Saudi Arabia, the one who managed
Mahdi.
the transition is from the South. He leveraged, he provided a lot of privileges to folks in the South. But, the way he was kicked out of the capital created grievances for people in the South to say, hey, see, this is what happened. It's all about the North and their problems. But others saw, no, it's not about the South and the North. It's about being Sunni or Shia in a way. Others saw it, no, it's about where do you come from. If even within the North, if you are from the north of the North, or you are from the south of the North in a way. And people started, the division started taking place in a number of places. And this is what you end up seeing. There are so many contradictions that really we have witnessed. Ali Abdullah Saleh, the ex-president, who is now has a coalition with the Houthis, he fought the Houthis 6 times. He led 6 wars against the Houthis. Saudi Arabia, who fought against the Republicans who wanted to get rid of kingdom back in the 60s, are now standing for democracy and republicanism because they see Houthis as folks who want to return back to kingdom lifestyle. So you see all these contradictions that take shape, and foreign observers, of course, they don't get to see that complexity. The very map that we see here, the very division is no longer the traditional division that we have. And that's what I think partly what's happening is that if things will drag on, if the war will drag on, we see ourselves maybe splitting into a number of states, or at least de facto sort of politics will lead us to that. So, I mean, those complexities that have been at play for the past 20 to 30 years have really worked against each other. I mean, I will conclude with this. The ex-president, again, Ali Abdullah Saleh, because he is the one who saw the whole problem in a way. He would use the Islamists, Islahis, against the socialists back during the Civil War. The first Civil War was in 1994, when the war was taking place between the South and the North. And then he used, of course, I mean, for the Islamists, it was a fight against the secularists, socialists, and not considered believers, and all that. So he used that card to support them. He used the Islamists, the Sunni for the most part, in his fights against the Houthis during the 6 wars. And when time came, he rallied around with Houthis and kicked the rest, really, you know. So folks like this, leaders like this, who really never thought of their own societies as societies, who thought of their countries in terms of their own personal perspective, certainly created a recipe for disaster. And right now, what is a Yemeni? How do we define what is Yemeni? I'm teaching, if I want to teach about Yemeni culture, a course about Yemeni culture, it will be really challenging. And most of the things I've said here, I'll be challenged by Yemenis. If there are Yemenis around here, I know there is one here. And others in Facebook and Twitter, whatever. People challenge you all the time because they box you immediately. The moment you criticize Saudi Arabia, I'm immediately boxed as a Houthi sympathizer. The moment I criticize the Houthis, then I am not a patriot. I'm not like someone who cares and loves them. I am another American who they want to hate me, basically, who they want to hate in a way. So, and depends on who you talk to. So the voice of reason is somehow is chained. And unless stability is brought again back to the country, we won't see anything rising that gives us hope that things will get better.
Let's go to the back here. Gentleman in the green shirt. Would you introduce yourself before asking your question?
Oh, okay. My name, can you hear me? Okay, my name Mohammed bin Jabr. I'm from Yemen, but
All right.
American citizen, chair of the department at UCO. So Amr told me about this event. Thank you for providing us this opportunity. But now I will ask you a question to clarify to me. I always get an argument with people when I try to defend Saudi Arabia. And when I say arguing with people, I mean American citizen and Yemeni. And I never lived in Saudi Arabia. I have no deals with Saudi Arabia, no tie with Saudi Arabia. But I see a lot of hatred in Yemenis against Saudis in the 80s, in the 70s, until now. And something I cannot understand. And the same thing here, even in America. And when we look at history, in 1962, Yemen was ruled by Imam and Houthi and the Shia. And the revolution in 1916, which is a monarchy, and the revolution in 1962, supported by Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, a war started in Yemen. And Jamal Abdel Nasser started giving this speech that he will collapse the monarchy of Saudi Arabia, and the monarchy of Saudi Arabia is impeding the progress of the Arabs' war. And Saudi Arabia finds itself involved in this war to support the Imam against Nasser, Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And Yemen went through a 7 war. Jamal Abdel Nasser support part of Yemen, and Saudi Arabia support the Houthi and the Imam. And when Jamal Abdel Nasser died, Saudi Arabia mediate between the fighters, and they reach agreement to share the power. And for 55 years, Saudi Arabia has been giving billions of dollars aid to Yemen to stabilize. And during these years, several times trying to negotiate whenever there is a problem in Yemen. 2 million Yemeni were immigrants in Saudi Arabia with no restriction. And now, before the Gulf War, when the Gulf War started.
Thank you for putting that.
When the Gulf
Before
War started, and Yemen
the 2 million
supported
came back.
Saddam, and Yemen supported Saddam Hussein, that's when Saudi Arabia starts putting restriction. Now this war, Saudi Arabia tried to mediate between the Yemeni, the Houthi and ex-president, and between Hadi and the legitimate government. And they gave billions of dollars in aid, so they get together, they get along. And then al-Houthi went and sent missiles to Saudi Arabia, and then you hear Iran saying, Sana'a fall, now it's part of the Shia border, and next is Mecca. Saudi Arabia again found itself, it has to fight for its existence. If it allows that, Iran takes South Yemen, Iran already took Iraq, it's still holding into Syria, and now Saudi Arabia will be surrounded by Iran, and we know the war between them. And they found themselves, they have to enter this war to protect themselves, not to spread democracy in Yemen. They don't have their own democracy. It just they feel like if they sit quiet, eventually their monarchy will collapse. My question is, with all these billions of dollars of aid and mediating, why this hatred, even in America? In Arab world, we consider Saudi is the puppy of the United States, and it's do the agenda of the United States. And here in the United States, we see Saudi Arabia is really bad country and it finance all terrorism and all this. Explain to me the logic, or what should Saudi Arabia do to get the support from the West or from the Arabs world or even from the Yemeni?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's really good to meet you, and hopefully get to know you after this, you know.
My wife and my brother-in-law can be
All right. Well, that's, yeah. All right, that sounds good. I would love to talk to you both, you know. So, I don't know if hatred is the right word to describe the popular attitude among Yemenis towards Saudi Arabia. There are grievances against the Saudis that have accumulated from the get-go, really, you know, from all the way from the beginning of the establishment of the kingdom, but starting really from during the Nasser era, where he was supporting republicanism and Saudis were supporting kingdoms, and they got engaged in a civil war, in a proxy war that Yemenis had to fuel in a way. So ever since then, what people have witnessed is that Saudi Arabia has not been that friendly to us for no reason. So that's to begin with, right? They wanted, and they had, I mean, there is an important relationship that we need to acknowledge. That Yemenis, there are so many Yemenis in Saudi Arabia, and there are so many intermarriages that's happening between Saudis and Yemenis. And this is, when we say Saudis, we're not talking even about the Saudi people, because culturally wise, there is so much similarities, there is so much international conversation. You know, people, when it comes to people-to-people relationships, things are not as bad as they may seem. But when it comes to critique of governance in Saudi Arabia, and not only governance, for their foreign policy towards Yemen, then you start seeing a lot of anger towards interventions. They're taking of negotiations by force and taking some territories, Yemeni territories, and claiming them as part of the Saudi borders, ruling in a very personal way and dealing in a very personal way with the people, punishing people at some point. And after 1990, when the regime, Yemenis were considered, Yemeni regime was considered supportive of Saddam Hussein, then Yemenis got punished. It was not the regime, it was the people who got punished. At least 2 million people were kicked back to the country. And ever since then, there have been a lot of restrictions. All the privileges that Yemeni labor in Saudi Arabia that were enjoying before 1990, and by the way, those privileges were not hand-given, they were negotiated as part of the conflict that at some point there was a conflict between the two kingdoms of the Hamid ad-Din family back before the revolution even, and the Saudi family. So these were negotiated. Privileges were to be given to Yemenis because of their neighbors. I mean, these were privileges that were, they were not privileges, they were rights that were negotiated as part of an agreement. So the accumulation, I guess, of the Saudi way of doing business in the country, on the one hand, you see a wave of religiosity coming from Saudi Arabia that is changing our way of life, Yemeni's way of life. Yemenis have, for the most part, been known for being moderate, religiously speaking, you know. But during the 90s in particular, we've seen a wave coming from Saudi Arabia that started, a Salafi wave, of course, ultra-conservative wave, that started seeing things in terms of believer and non-believer. That wave was not just taking place without a context. There was a context, and the context behind that was a political reconciliation that was taking place between the ex-president and Saudi Arabia. So there are so many tribal leaders that were in the bankrolls of the Saudi government way before the conflict started. So the continual like sort of interference of Saudis in the Yemeni affair makes people feel vulnerable. The sovereignty of Yemeni people is always, denied in a way. And Houthis use that rhetoric a lot. If you look at their literature, it was not much about America, although they used death to America really much for the most part. It was about sovereignty, how we reach a stage where we are no longer sovereign. We don't have our own say in how we run our life. Why do we have to respond always to dictations of the Saudi government on us, you know. There are, of course, some people will be willing to go all the way to conspiracy theory grounds, and I'm not comfortable going there, but they say that basically there's so much investment in the destruction of the country because of the oil reserves, because Yemen has oil reserves, but for the most part, we could not get hold of them because we have never reached any stability for the past 60 years. But I don't seriously buy that. So the lack of sovereignty, the popular grievance against Saudi Arabia, if you were to strip it out of all political, tribal, religious factors, at the core of it, you will see there is a sense of pride in being Yemeni, and that pride, because we are considered as the origin of Arabian Peninsula, the Prophet has a lot of sayings praising Yemen. So there is, in the collective memory of Yemenis, so much pride that keeps, that the Saudis, for the most part, keeps crashing, you know. And if you were to strip it out of all these contexts, and I don't know if, of course, we can always debate about this issue, but these are my quick takes about this.
Are there any more questions? You do.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, that seems to be
works?
working. Speak
All right.
right into it.
Hello, thank you for speaking today. I greatly appreciate it. It's been very interesting. So I wanted to ask you this question. Do you believe that the Yemenis people are destined for a true government in either way? Because how it seems currently is that they might be on a Cold War path with what's going on in the Middle East. That Cold War path being essentially the Saudi-backed anything versus the Iranian-backed anything. So every time Iran gets involved, Saudi gets involved, and it seems like the Yemenis essentially revolution on either side might amalgamate into something like this.
Yeah, I mean, scenarios in Yemen are really grim, you know. They're all dark, and I'm sure, a lot of those who follow Yemen will share that with me, that reading with me, because it's just maps talking, you know. Weaponry seems to have the louder voice in a way. There were so many moments where it was possible, and I think there might be moments coming up also that there is that possibility for reconciliation, and that reconciliation, in part, could be brought by the Saudis' economic anxieties around the economy, and their economy is screaming a little bit, and Houthis' exhaustion, regime's realization that they have so much wealth at stake to lose, and there are, with wars dragging on, there are always moments where you think there will be a breakthrough, where people will negotiate and get out of it, you know. But so far they've negotiated for 3 months in Kuwait. Didn't work. Even until Kuwait, they said, hey, you're not welcome anymore. You know, we don't want to host you anymore. 3 months is too much. So at some point, there were Geneva conventions. There were a number of attempts to do that. There are actively going on conversation around creating new rounds for negotiations, and there is always that chance, you know. But the problem is, even if there is some sort of reconciliation, mistrust is there. It's at its highest. Nobody trusts the other. We're talking only about the power brokers, power players at this stage, really. They don't trust each other. They have developed animosity that I have no idea how they will be able to transcend in a way. What is the ground that they will be able to reach to? If they are going to reach to dividing the country into 6 regions the way it was initially envisioned, that won't work out because it will create potential for disaster. Because there is no central government technically that will be able to at least do some control. What will be the sort of reconciliation that will be taking place? You have, when we talk about the coalition, the Saudi coalition and all that, we're talking also about folks who, the coalition is really broad, too broad, I think, to control. And that's also part of the problem. How would you fight extremists like Al-Qaeda? How would you fight Salafis, extremists who are not quite there, هو not Al-Qaeda, he didn't reach Al-Qaeda level yet, but may down the road become as such, you know. These usually won't respond to any external forces. They would respond to their own dynamics. The dynamics that are being created as we speak creates further conditions for conflicts that even if we were to reconcile as today, it becomes really challenging to imagine or think of how can we go beyond the divisions beyond that. National reconciliation would be the biggest challenge if there were some sort of a deal reached. And that actually, in my own opinion, what the primary challenge in the whole situation when it comes to think of it in terms of hope, you know.
Well, thank you. That was a good last question about what the possibilities are. I would like to everybody to thank you very much, Waleed.
Thank you all for having me.
And we have a beautiful